I think this is going to be part 5. I might be wrong, but I'll have the correct one in the title. The the little diagram here, the era of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it just gives where certain times that certain pieces came from. Okay, like the Babylonian exile, Maccabean revolt, average date of the Temple Scroll, earliest likely paleographic date of a Dead Sea Scroll. It just gives all these, tries to give all these pieces of what time they were created, when, and they vary a great deal. Let's see here. Here's what we're going to do now. The War Scroll. Is the war to end all wars an allegory or a prophecy? The Hebrew Bible, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the New Testament all speak of this final cataclysm. Of the almost 900 manuscripts that we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is one that has captured the modern imagination and convinced scholars and lay people alike that it speaks directly to us from 2,000 years ago, foretelling events that seem eerily relevant. This is the War Scroll. Oh, excuse me. A document 9.5 feet long, consisting of 19 columns of commentary on several different sources of the known Bible, particularly Daniel 11:12, in which an eschatological war of epic proportions is fought between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. In 81 to 96 CE, Common Era, Joe Primal tells me, this portent of Armageddon recurs in the New Testament book of Revelation, in which John describes the final violent confrontation between the forces of good and evil in vivid scenes of conflagration, descending angels, and the raising of the dead for the final judgment. These various doomsday predictions arose out of the cauldron of the Mideast, a war-torn region. The ongoing conflict in this region and the seemingly intractable divisions there seem to give credence to the visionary quality of the War Scroll. In addition to stories describing the 49-year conflict, the War Scroll, one of the original 7 Dead Sea Scrolls discovered, details the age of the soldiers in battle and may have even served as a military manual for the inhabitants of Qumran. It is interesting to note that the lands mentioned in the War Scroll prophecies are the same as the ones now engulfed in conflict: Mesopotamia, Iraq, Assyria, which is Syria, and Persia, Iran. Also important to remember is the War Scroll was written by a group who had fled the persecution of the Romans, and before that the Babylonians, and before that the Persians. Is it any surprise that their worldview was apocalyptic? I can see now that they might be. I'm not going to go there. My 2 cents will not be spent. Let's see, world was apocalyptic. These are people who couldn't fall asleep without fearing they would be the next casualty of war. Yet, even our modern world, we are intrigued and unsettled by the suggestion that these prophecies were meant for us. And we see the signs everywhere. Some view the events of 9/11 as the onset of the final confrontation and believe the current global economic turmoil is indicative of the general collapse of civilization. Every day the news brings news stories of atrocities. An ancient Jewish belief holds that time will end 6,000 years after Adam, when the arrival of the Messiah will signal the advent of Armageddon. I was going to say something about that 6,000 years, but I'm not. That puts us right smack in the bull's. Oh, here we go. Let's see. An ancient Jewish belief holds that the time will end 6,000 years after Adam, when the arrival of the Messiah will signal the advent of Armageddon. That puts us right smack in the bullseye. The scrolls were written 4,000 years after Adam. That was 2,000 years ago. Will a malevolent army led by Belial, the devil, wage a war against humanity, which will mark the end of time as we know it? I believe that'll happen. Did the mysterious community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls 2,000 years ago intend to warn us of impending global destruction? Over and over, the War Scroll refers to the dreaded enemy as the Kittim. K-I-T-T-I-M. Kittim, probably. Yet they are never specifically identified. They are the armies of Belial, the evil ones who must be destroyed, the persecutors who come in the night to gouge out the eyes of their victims. Or maybe the writers of the scrolls meant to convey that every great civilization will be tested eventually. Were their intentions simply to warn us to reflect and protect what is good so we may continue our existence? It is a subject that continues to fascinate both scholars and laymen. Let's see here. It's kind of... I could pretty much tell there's going to be nothing here about salvation, but that's okay. We'll get into some prophecies anyway. The worldviews of the writers of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the early Christians were similar in many ways. As both groups grew out of the same cultural, geographic, linguistic, and religious traditions, it is not surprising that many of their beliefs, culled from the Hebrew Bible, are similar. Plus, they're from the same culture. Of note is the shared prediction that a Messiah would appear who would heal the sick, raise up the poor, and vanquish the forces of evil. But there is a point at which the two groups part and move in different directions. The sectarians at Qumran believed in purifying themselves in readiness for salvation. This involved elaborate rituals of personal hygiene and diet and the shunning of anyone who couldn't or wouldn't obey the sect, like section, the sect, like S-E-C-T-S. The sects. I'm sorry, it sounds like sex when I say it. The groups obey the group's rules and adhere to its rigorously spiritual lifestyle. I think we talk about the Essenes. Conversely, the task of Jesus and the early Christians, as they saw it, was to spread their message across the globe. They believed less in strict adherence to laws and rules and more in acts of faith. Nevertheless, certain fundamental beliefs were held in common. I'm not going to touch that. While there is much speculation about end times, many scholars have pointed out that the apocalyptic literature was written not to scare but to comfort the afflicted, that it was meant to remind the persecuted that God would intervene to save the righteous. Amen. Can we then take comfort from the thought of a final showdown in which the bad guys are run out of town once and for all? That's corny. That doesn't work, but you get the gist of it. There ain't going to be no town. Many have pointed to the astonishing technological advances that have shrunk the virtual globe and compressed time as a fulfillment of Nostradamus' prediction that the world will become smaller. Is this proof that there is a connection between doomsday prophecies and today's events, known as the Nostradamus effect? There is much about the times in which we live that might seem to indicate that the old cartoons depicting bearded prophets of doom carrying signs reading, "The end is near," may someday ring true. That's always been the case. The end is near. They even said that in the New Testament. Let's do something here. We got time. They typically, I'm reading this thing over to here, then down here, and then they have little pieces, like a little story here, a little story here, that are part of this, but they aren't part of this, the overall statement. It's just something supporting. So I'm going to read this here. I have no idea what this is about. It's about the third temple. I think everyone's seen that before. Some fervent believers in the apocalypse want to hasten the coming of the Messiah and the unfolding of the final confrontation. Yeah, there's a lot of groups pushing for that. A group of Jews in Israel is determined to fulfill the end of the world prophecy by building a third temple on Jerusalem's Temple Mount. This is the holiest of Hebrew sites, believed to be where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac, where David built the first temple, and where the Ark of the Covenant was housed. For Jews, this is the only place on earth where the Spirit of God dwells among us. Okay, that's for Jews. Because we know, as believers in Jesus, following the teachings of Jesus, where does he dwell? Okay, how do we know that? Well, hopefully we're following John 14. We've obeyed the commands. We love... Oh, spider, go home. Get out of there. And he comes to dwell in us, manifest himself to us, filling us with the Spirit, Spirit of truth, Spirit of Jesus, Spirit of God. John 14. Fortunately, the Jews don't have that in their book. You need to get a new book. The only place on earth where the Spirit of God dwells among us. Remember, we are the church. We are the stones of that church. The spiritual church. These guys are going to build a building. I wish them the best. However, there is a problem because the Temple Mount is also the noble sanctuary of the sacred site of the Muslims. See a conflict there? Maybe they could bring in Trump and do some negotiating. Where the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock stand now is, Muslims believe, the very site where Muhammad ascended to heaven. Some fundamentalist Christians who are also eager to hasten the coming of the Messiah, which means for them the return... Hang on, let me slow that down. You can see what you have going on here. There's three groups. The Muslims have it, the Jews want it, and now the Christians got their angle, all in the same piece of dirt. Let's do this again. Some fundamentalist Christians who are also eager to hasten the coming of the Messiah, which means for them the return of Jesus, side with the Jews who want to tear down the mosque and rebuild the temple. Were such a thing to occur, the jihad that would result might be the final battle we tremble to anticipate. That actually is a little revelation-wise. You've got, because now you have that conflict there. Now you'd be thinking, well, why are certain Christians want to hasten the coming of Jesus, the return? Oh, the world's so bad, they want to get over this and that. And it's actually very foolish. We are to be ready, prepared for the coming, not trying to force God's hand. Okay? I don't get into, I could really go into some conspiracy theory on that, but that's not, I don't want to do that. But can you imagine? You've got, the Muslims have it, they have possession of it, the Jews want it, and some Christians are supporting, a lot of evangelicals. We need to help the Jews go back home to that and build that temple, this and that, and then Jesus will come. We want to help. That's part of that deal. That's bad teaching. I know most people believe that, but that's, you need to help the Jews read the New Testament. That's all the help they need. Now, here's another one here. It's just a short one, then we'll wrap it up. Who are the Ketim, I'm calling them? Anytime I am in Israel, they always have that, like Nephilim. I could be wrong. Who are the Ketim? And the dominion of the Ketim shall come to an end, so that wickedness shall be laid low without any remnant, and there shall be no survivor of the sons of darkness. That's a quote out of the War Scroll. First, the Babylonians invaded and destroyed Jerusalem, driving most of the Jews out. Persecuting the ones who stayed, Israel had many enemies: the hordes of Moab, Edom, Ammon, and the Philistines, all of whom it perceived as united in the army of Belial, the evil one, Satan. Then, in 63 BCE, the Roman army under General Pompey wreaked havoc all over again. When the sect, hey, I did that. Okay, that's what I was trying to say before. It sounded like sex. When the sect at Qumran were writing the scrolls, the Romans had sacked the temple and were hot on their heels. So it is generally believed that Kitim was a code word for Romans. Years of research, however, have convinced scholars that it was meant to be a mutable word that encompassed all villains, the entire army of the sons of darkness. For this final war, this end yields no prisoners. The writers of the War Scroll believed it in absolute adherence to the strict code of purity, in which violators of the covenant were doomed to perish into damnation once the sovereignty of God was established forever in the final victorious battle. The covenant. The covenant. You need to know what the covenant is. You know what the covenant is, but what time we got here? Let's wrap that up. I don't want to go too long here. We'll do that separate. I think that was part 5. The next piece we're going to be is something about the prophecy. Love you. God bless.